behind the bars they never asked for. Testimonies from Palestinians freed after years in Israeli custody, and the unanswered questions about abuse, arbitrary detention and impunity. Khan Yunis. When Muhammad Abu Musa stepped off the cramped transport van and saw the ruins of his city, the shock was not only that his home had been flattened or that family members had been killed in the months since his arrest. It was that the world that had watched his disappearance for so long, the courts, the press, the international community, had not been able to hear until now the catalogue of humiliation he says he endured inside Israeli detention. Days without sleep, repeated beatings, shackling during interrogation, and months of incommunicado confinement with no charge filed before a judge. Visit their prisons, he told a small group of relatives on the day he arrived. Only inside will you understand how merciless it was. Abu Musa is one of nearly 2,000 Palestinians released in recent weeks under a deal that followed brutal months of war and siege. Their stories, collected by rights groups and independent reporters, echo with a consistent drumbeat. Arbitrary arrest, prolonged detention without trial, degrading treatment, and, in multiple cases, allegations of torture that demand urgent, independent scrutiny. For many families, release was not an ending but the beginning of another fight. To recover the names of those who died in custody, to account for mutilated bodies returned without explanation, and to compel transparent investigations that so far have been promised and delayed. A system built on silence. For decades, Israel has relied on a combination of military orders, administrative detention and security legislation to detain Palestinians from the occupied territories in Gaza. Human rights organizations say those legal tools are being deployed not merely to detain suspects but to suppress political activity and enable indefinite, opaque imprisonment. Released detainees consistently describe being held in solitary or incommunicado, denied regular access to counsel and family, and subjected to interrogation methods that cross international legal lines. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem have documented patterns of arbitrary detention and ill treatment that rights experts say amount to systemic abuse. Welcome to Hell, reads one rights organization report compiling testimony from dozens of former detainees. The accounts are granular and disturbing. Detainees blindfolded and tightly bound, slammed into walls, stripped of dignity through forced standing and sleep deprivation, and paraded in degrading photographs. Many say they were accused but never formally charged. Others were held for months before access to a lawyer or a prosecutor was permitted. Those practices, human rights lawyers say, violate the most basic requirements of fair trial and humane treatment under international law. The families who waited. Across Gaza, families kept vigil for months for a phone call they rarely received. Some received no notice at all, only discovered a father or son was detained when a neighbor or a soldier arrived. For the women who emerged from Gaza's rubble to meet released relatives, the reunion was cruelly complicated. Joy mixed with the horror of seeing bodies returned with signs of extreme violence, a reality now documented by health officials and independent observers. In one set of transfers last week, Gazan authorities reported that at least 135 bodies returned from Israeli custody bore signs consistent with summary executions and torture, claims that Israeli authorities deny and that rights groups say must be investigated by an impartial international body. These are not isolated anecdotes. United Nations investigators and major rights groups over the last 2 years have warned of a spike in arbitrary arrests and incommunicado detention, a practice that renders accountability nearly impossible. The UN Human Rights Office found patterns of prolonged and secret detention that breach international obligations and strip detainees of any meaningful judicial protection. The result: families left in limbo, prisoners whose fate is decided outside any transparent legal process. The charges, and the lack of evidence. Israeli authorities argue that many detentions are necessary to prevent attacks and protect civilians. Yet in dozens of cases examined by independent monitors, detainees were held without charge, or on the basis of secret evidence shielded from defense attorneys, or subjected to administrative detention renewals that offered no prospect of a timely trial. Medical professionals, journalists, and humanitarian workers have also been detained, some for years, despite the absence of credible evidence linking them to hostilities. The detention of health workers in particular has raised alarms within the international medical community. AP News. Legal experts point out a glaring structural problem. When detentions occur outside transparent judicial scrutiny, allegations of abuse are unlikely to be investigated credibly by the same authorities that oversee the detention system. Without independent inquiries, preferably international in nature, allegations of torture, degrading treatment, and even deaths in custody risk remaining unexamined. Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have repeatedly urged impartial probes into detainee treatment and deaths. Voices from inside. The most damning evidence often comes from the mouths of those who lived the experience. One former detainee told investigators he was kept in a small cell and forced into painful positions for hours while interrogators shouted accusations and threats. Another described guards publishing humiliating images online. The common thread is the same. A system where legal safeguards were insufficient to protect the dignity and health of those detained. Rights groups compiled dozens of similar testimonies into reports that, taken together, describe a pattern rather than isolated violations. The international community's uneasy response. Global reactions have been uneven. Some governments have demanded transparency and released measured statements calling for independent probes. Others have framed the issue primarily as one of security and refused to press harder. International legal bodies and human rights groups insist that security cannot be a blank check for arbitrary detention and torture. Accountability, they argue, is not only a legal obligation but a moral one. No state should be allowed to operate detention regimes beyond oversight without consequences. What justice looks like. For the families of the disappeared and the newly freed, justice is practical and immediate. They want the names of those who died and the circumstances of death. They want investigations that can lead to prosecutions if crimes were committed. They want reparations and the restoration of dignity. For the broader international legal community, justice also means systemic reform, an end to indefinite administrative detention without remedy, transparent judicial review of detentions, prohibition and investigation of torture allegations, and protections for humanitarian workers and journalists. Memory, truth, and a fragile hope. Muhammad Abu Mousa's first night home was not peaceful. He woke to nightmares and to the sudden absence of a son he would never hold again. His story, and those of hundreds like him, forces a question upon the global conscience. Can the world accept a status quo where lives are taken in custody, where bodies are returned in pieces, where families face silence instead of answers? The powerful, the compassionate, and the law-bound must demand more than promises. They must insist on investigations, on accountability, and on legal guarantees that detention will never again be a place where human rights go to die.